Environmental rights law firm All Rise has developed an impact assessment guide in isiZulu and English. The bilingual guide is designed as a tool to assist rural communities understand the impact of mega projects in their area. The initiative is part of ensuring that communities fully participate in environmental impact assessments in a language they understand. Janice Toohey is the co-founder and executive director at All Rise. Janice, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. What brought the initiative about?
We've been working with communities for several years now and have come to realize that people are asked to participate in legal processes and they don't actually understand it because it's spoken to them in a language that's not spoken by them. So we were actually responding to an innovation grant that was put out by the International Association for Impact Assessment. And together with the South African affiliates, IASA, All Rise and IASA then put in a proposal which was accepted to then develop this guide in isiZulu.
Talk us about the process of developing it. I mean, you take a look at the word itself, environmental impact assessment, turning that into isiZulu, and maybe that was a simple job, but what was the process that went behind it?
Yeah. So the concepts, I think, behind environmental impact assessment are not just difficult to grasp, but there's a lot of legislation that regulates and prescribes the process, which is quite complicated. And we didn't want to just take the English legislation, the legal language, and then do a straight translation. So part of the project was actually to workshop these concepts and develop examples with communities, all done in isiZulu, so that the guide is relevant, using culturally appropriate examples and using terminology rather than just doing a straight isiZulu English translation.
We understand it's a 70-page bilingual guide in both isiZulu and English. Did you find yourself having to develop language along the way?
Yes, so we worked with people who work in the sector in environmental impact assessment and communities, where isiZulu is their first language, but also they're very fluent in English as well. So it was bridging the gap, I think, between communities and the English version of people who work with communities and actually understand the language. So that was how we bridged the gap and made something, we developed something that was appropriate and easily understood.
Sure. Did you have to rely on the help of, what are people who study languages called? So more specifically, whom isiZulu is their beat, and they would therefore, be able to contribute. Because when you spoke about how sometimes the legislation and the jargon behind it is so complicated, right? So there's a big difference in two words that are similar but mean two different things. And so did you have to rely on people that actually study isiZulu or develop the language?
Yeah, so we didn't use language specialists, but we used stakeholder engagement specialists. So a company called Wikiwe, which is headed by a woman, Bongi Shinga, who works in the environmental industry and is isiZulu speaking. So she has a very good feel of how to use the language so that it is understood. I think we're also very mindful that isiZulu has various dialects. So if you go into northern KwaZulu-Natal, in the areas where our clients work, the isiZulu spoken might be a little bit different to what's spoken in eThekwini and Durban. So it's a guide. It's meant to be used and developed for the different situations it's used in, and it's really, as I say, a guide that we hopefully will be used by others.
Okay, maybe we can talk about why it was necessary, right? So maybe giving practical examples in terms of what you saw where communities were not consulted and what happened after that.
No, so in many of the communities we work with are mining affected communities where the mines already started and communities ask us to come in and assist them because they're dealing with huge impacts like dust, noise, they've lost water, they've lost grazing land, they've had to resettle, they've had graves that have been relocated. So these are a very traumatized community who live in terrible conditions every day. And hearing their experiences of there was an EIA done, it went through the proper process, government made a decision on those findings, and yet many people woke up to the bulldozers and the back actors tearing down their ancestral huts and told that they have no choice, they have to move, and yet they were never invited properly to participate in the process. But if you read the reports, there was a long checklist that they had been consulted. So I think that's a common experience in many, sadly a common experience in many of our communities in South Africa. And also it's a sad indictment that 26 years of EIAs, of this environmental licensing, we're no closer to capacitating and empowering local people to understand these processes so they can participate in them. Because we live in a constitutional democracy and people have a right to participate, especially in processes that end up in decisions about their lives and their livelihoods and their culture. And so we find even now, 26 years later, we don't have this capacity that's been developed. And sadly, many communities who don't have access to legal services to try and make their voice heard are suffering. And I think this is a first attempt to, if we can't rely on government and environmental consultants to make sure that the law is applied, that people are empowered through this guide to actually understand the process and demand that their voices are heard, because it is their right.
And therein lies the problem, Janice, because if you've got government and environmental assessors who have a checklist and say, well, the community was consulted, but they actually... Is it a matter of not understanding, or is it a matter of not even being consulted, right? So whether you do it in isiZulu or you do it in English, if you're bypassing people and you are going ahead and people see bulldozers the next day, what do we even call that? Is it corruption? Is it bypassing people? Is it illegal? What is the term for that? Because is that not the major concern? What to do with that? Where people are taken advantage of?
Yeah. No, certainly. And our Constitution gives everyone the right to decisions made by government, to just administrative action, and then involves decisions that are made lawfully, procedurally fair, and reasonable decisions. And just last year, in four judgments for big projects, two of them for the seismic testing, the Shell matter, the Searcher matter, where the courts actually stopped and cancelled licenses because people hadn't been consulted, and they hadn't been consulted in their own language. A similar judgment in Richards Bay last year, where Eskom was building a emergency gas power station. And again, the consultants had said in their reports that almost 80% of people in the area spoke isiZulu, and yet none of the notices, none of the reports were actually issued in English. In isiZulu, they were all done in English and Afrikaans. So we have very good law to protect people's rights and ensure their public participation. And we have the courts affirming those rights. And we seem to have this gap in the middle of practice. And I think it's bridging the gaps between consultants and communities, so there can be a two-way flow of information, and not just this checklist approach, which the courts have said is just not adequate.
How far and wide is this? You mentioned a little bit earlier on that unfortunately this happens quite a lot. How far and wide is it? Is there a figure that we can interrogate?
It's quite hard to say, because not all environmental decisions based on these EIA processes and public participation process end up in court or appealed. So many communities, they don't know their rights. So as I say, they wake up, the bulldozers are there, they're displaced, and their lives are worse off. And because they don't understand their rights and they don't have access to these legal processes, many of them are silent. But I think communities are now around South Africa are becoming enlightened. Certainly civil society is trying to pass this information on. We have a lot of community activists taking this information back to their communities and sharing it with other communities. So we are seeing this growing awareness. But it is, sadly, it's very widespread. And it's worse off in the rural communities because out of sight, out of mind. And often their voices are just not heard. And so it's very widespread. Very much so in the mining industry, but most of these mega projects where they're done relatively short processes, done quite quickly without adequate resources, and you end up in these impacts that are not mitigated, people compensated.
You've also got, is it called Indona? I'm not quite sure, so maybe the traditional authority in certain spaces. This is also done without them taking part in the processes, or do they know?
No, generally they are consulted. So it's the traditional authorities across South Africa, and then specifically in KwaZulu-Natal we have isiNduna, which are the headmen of the villages. So you get the traditional council, which is sort of the group of elders, and the Nkosi, the chief, and then in each village will have a leader. So often the leaders are brought on board, they are consulted, but often in the communities that we'll deal with, these traditional leaders are financially benefiting from these projects coming in. So they are pro the project, and they often sanction anyone in the community who tries to speak up. Not all communities, there are many traditional leaders who are also opposed to projects where projects don't actually hear the voice of the people. But sadly, many of these projects end up dividing the community between the projects, and you end up with communities that were quite harmonious now in conflict, and even within families, a lot of conflict. So it's quite varied. I don't think you can say it's one or the other. It depends on the community. And there are many good traditional leaders that do protect the interests of their community. Just on that as well, in the Shell matter last year, in the court said that in our constitutional democracy, there's no law that only allows community leaders to be consulted, and the traditional leadership do not represent the individual community members in these matters. So our courts have also spoken about that. And even though people might not have a title deed, they certainly have protected informal rights in our legislation.
Okay. A two-pronged question before we leave. What is the consequence of the division that is sowed within communities and within families? And are there good examples? Is there a good story to tell around this?
It's hard to think of one right now.
That's telling.
Because many of our clients, we're working with a community where we've had a client assassinated. Mam Shanghaz was assassinated for speaking out against the mining project in the area. And in that community, we've had many people traumatized, people assaulted, people's houses burned down. So that's often where the project's been going for a long time. And you have this division where some people support the project and some people don't. But in other communities, there are communities that stand together because they know their land is worth so much more than the few 100,000 they might be given. So we are seeing more communities standing together now because they've seen other examples where a few 100,000 rand might seem a lot of money to have cash in your hand, but it doesn't last very long, and it's certainly unparalleled to the wealth that you have when you own land and when you're able to live off that land and make a living off that land. And your whole culture is embodied in that land and identity and your ancestors and your future generations. So I think people are starting to realize the value of land more and standing together. But sadly, there are too many communities that are divided, and we're seeing violence. People don't live at home anymore. They have to flee. So I think because we're, in the legal space, we're representing communities who've been wronged, But we certainly try and engage with proactive communities before these projects start. So if the project does go ahead, at least it's a more sustainable project.
How many of you are there? So, because KwaZulu-Natal is quite big, and that's just about one province, right?
It is, and we're the only law clinic specifically dealing with environmental and climate change matters in KZN, but we're not the only ones, and we have many partners. So there's only 2 of us attorneys in our law clinic, and a community manager. So it's a very small team, and we get constant requests to help other communities. And we try and do it in various ways, but certainly we can't take on all matters. So there are other law clinics in the country. There are other NGOs that are very strong. So we often partner up. And then by powering communities themselves, they're able to deal with and engage with government and demand their rights directly as well. So that's ultimately our goal, is to empower as many communities as possible. And I think this is what we're trying to do, one small tool through the EIA tool in isiZulu, and then we'd like to roll this out in isiXhosa as well, and some of the other languages. Certainly, there's not enough of us in civil society to take on every challenge, but certainly trying to empower people to take on their own challenges too.
This is a mammoth task. Godspeed. Thank you very much, Janice Toohey, co-founder and executive director at All Rise. Still to come, we take a look at what